Good morning. My name's Sarah Brown. I'm one of the team here at St John's. This morning we're going to look at an Old Testament figure. His name is Nehemiah, and it's particularly appropriate for us to look at this time when we're starting to think about rebuilding after the recent coronavirus lockdown. But first, just looking back a little while to when the lockdown started. I, like lots of other people, felt confused and frightened at that time. I was reading in one of my Bible studies the story about Jesus with his disciples in the boat in the storm. You might remember Jesus was asleep while the disciples were absolutely terrified. And as I read that, it was a reminder to me that Jesus is the Lord of all creation. He's the Lord of the wind and the waves. He's the Lord of everything. And so at that time I prayed, and I still pray, that Jesus will overcome this tiny virus that's causing such an amount of harm and hurt over the whole world now. I believe that God is hearing my prayer. But during the lockdown weeks, I've begun to think slightly differently about what's going on. We've been affected by a terrible virus. I don't want to underplay that in any shape or form. People have been killed. I'm sure that there are people listening today who've been struck down by the virus, who've had friends and relatives who've perhaps lost people who they love very much. It's been a really difficult time, not just physically, emotionally, socially, in all kinds of ways, and I don't want to undermine that in any shape or form. But as I've been thinking, it occurred to me that there are very many other things in the world that are affecting also a huge number of people. We've heard about some of them in the last couple of weeks at St John's on the online services. You might remember we heard about Justin talking about Church Action for Tax Justice. We heard last week about the mission organisations that St John's supports. And this made me think, there are such a lot of people in the world stuck in poverty, in discrimination, in all sorts of terrible things, perhaps as a refugee, whatever it is. And for these people, their suffering often doesn't have an end in sight. And then, of course, there's been the news as well, and we've heard about the Black Lives Matter protests. We've heard about people who are campaigning about the issue of slavery and the way slavery has funded so much in our country. As someone whose relatives on both sides of my family come from Liverpool, a great city that made a lot of money out of slavery, this really made me think. And I actually looked online to find out about slavery today. I discovered, to my horror, that there are, they reckon, 3 times as many people enslaved today in the world as there were during the 17th and 18th centuries. 3 times as many. These things made me really think about our pandemic and about the other suffering that there is in the world. I really felt now is the time, yes, to start rebuilding after the pandemic of coronavirus, but also that we must not let this time go without starting to build some solution for all these other issues. Now, as I thought about that, it seemed like an enormous task. And that made me think about this Old Testament figure, Nehemiah, that I mentioned at the start. Now, Nehemiah was someone who was living in exile. You might remember that before Nehemiah's time, the Babylonians had invaded Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, destroyed the buildings, and taken many of the Jewish people into their own country to live there in exile. This was something that God had warned them about repeatedly through the prophets, that if they continued to disobey God, this is what would happen. So, at the time of Nehemiah, he was working in a really important place in the king's court. He prayed about the situation in Jerusalem. He didn't just go barging in, he took time to pray and ask God what to do. He went to the king and said, I would really like to go to Jerusalem and start rebuilding the wall. The king agreed. Not only did he agree, he sent him on his way with letters to help ease his way through all the different countries he'd go through, and also with an armed guard. That's what you call support from the king. So, we're going to hear something now about Nehemiah's first part of what he did to restore the wall of Jerusalem. Liz is going to read for us. And first of all, the first section is about the survey that Nehemiah did when he got to Jerusalem. The second bit that Liz is going to read, I feel for you, Liz, thank you for offering to do this, has a lot of very difficult names in it. Now, it's easy to switch off when you hear all these names, but the reason that I've asked Liz to read it is because it's really good just to think about who it was that helped to rebuild these walls. So we'll talk a little bit more about this after Liz has read.